Hello, everybody. Welcome to Redgate's Community Circle SSRS class. As part of Redgate's response to all kind of the turmoil and uncertainty that's going on in the world, we are supplying a number of free classes and other activities to kind of support the community that's always been really great to us, and we want to be good to everybody as well. For example, Kendra has a T-SQL class, beginning T-SQL class for free. That's amazing. She is an amazing instructor and very knowledgeable. Steve Jones has a class on Power BI and DAX. And Grant Fritchie has a class on query tuning. So be sure to check those out in the other activities that we have planned. And this is the introduction to SQL Server Reporting Services. This is the second week of the class. And this week, I want to focus on data sources, data sets, and really building your first report from scratch, not with the wizard. So we'll take a look at that. And what I have found over the years of teaching a lot of people, probably close to 100 people, or probably maybe even more than that, that this is a real sticking point. Understanding what each one of those things means and, you know, the best way to go about it. So pay really close attention to this class. Make sure you got it before trying out any of the new things we'll learn in subsequent classes. There's a number of resources for you. A live class through Zoom, like the one today. You can watch the videos of the classes. You can either go to Redgate Hub, click on the Community Circle playlist on YouTube, and that Redgate Hub will get you to Redgate University, where all the recordings are going. I am putting up materials such as the answer to the previous class's homework, that class's homework, and the slides. So be sure to look there for these materials. And there's also a forum set up. I don't see anybody out there talking except for me yet. But if you have any questions for me or want to just discuss with other people taking the class, be sure to take a look out there. And also, there is an article out on Simple Talk about this very topic that I've written that you can take a look at. And I'm going to bring up my browser really quick so you can see. So we've got the GitHub. Each week I'll have I've got week 1 stuff out there. I'll go ahead and put week 2 out there either later today or tomorrow. I've got the series on reporting services. You can get to the, let's see, that's the forum. You can get to the recordings from either YouTube or on this university data platform. Okay, so that's all the resources. And let's get back to the slides. So first of all, I don't think there's any questions. If there are, let me know. I do have a few housekeeping things from last week that I want to address. Even though I've been focusing on 2019 Visual Studio with the add-in, since it is harder to set up, there's an extra step. I'm going to show you just for a couple of minutes how to create the project in 2017. There's some subtle differences. And also, I couldn't find on the 2019 how to format the page itself, basically the margins and whether it's landscape or portrait. Of course, immediately after last week's class, I found that. So I want to show you that. So I'm going to hop over to my virtual machine. And first of all, I'm going to open up 2017. So this is 2017 with the SSDT add-in. which is, at least for now, it's still available. And it's just one download and one install instead of a couple of steps. So some of you might have done that. This is the traditional look of Visual Studio. And to get started, say New, Project, and look for, and do I even have, I don't know, I don't even have the reporting services piece installed here. But what you would do is look in this area for reporting services project or reporting services wizard. So that's how you get started with that. So I'm just going to close that up. It's not too helpful since I don't have the report piece installed there. However, I do have it in 2019. I'm going to just open up, let's see, was that last week's on the 20th? Last week's on the 20th, and what I was trying to do was format the page, and I couldn't find the menu I was looking for, and it might be that they've changed it, or maybe what I really needed to do was go in and look through here for toolbars. There's the report toolbar. I still don't see it. But anyway, for this report, if I preview it, it will look okay unless I switch it to the print, basically print preview mode. So I'm going to open up one of these and click this icon, this print layout. This will show you what it will actually look like when it's printed. And notice that the sales column is ending up on the wrong page. Now, what you can do for ad hoc is go here to page setup and change it basically to landscape. Change the margins, whatever you want to do. However, I don't believe this sticks with the report definition. You will lose, and here I've got every other page, also not a very good thing, but you will lose any changes you make there. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to go back to the design, and up here are some icons that you can use. So this little wrench, which I had not seen before, is a report properties. So it used to be a report menu up at the top, and now that seems to be gone. So what I can do is make it landscape. I can change the paper size. Be really careful here. Make sure it's a paper size that the printers where you work are supported there. You can change the menu, the margins. I typically start with 0.25 and then adjust as necessary. And then also just make sure you drag everything in. And for some reason, I don't see anything that's keeping me from dragging this in, but it's not wanting to go. Another thing you can do is put rulers on here. So what you need to do is make sure that the width of your report plus the two margins are not greater than your paper size. And I'm still not sure why I'm not able to drag this in. I feel like there's something going on. Let's see. Something I'm not seeing. I should be able to pull that in. And it's not happening. But that's, where you change those settings. Hopefully it's not a new bug introduced that doesn't let me pull things in. It's probably, okay, I'm gonna not worry about this one. This is probably the one that was set up by the wizard, so there might be something there that I'm not seeing. So let's go back to the slides. Obviously, okay, so let's talk about data sources. What in the world is a data source? A data source is really the address. Where does my data live? My data might live in a SQL server. It might live in Oracle. It might be in out in Azure someplace. It might be in analysis services. And one of the best practices is when you create data sources to save them at the project level. And what I typically do is that I will create my data sources in my project and always give it the same name for the same server database, okay, for the same exact location. That way, when I publish my reports, my report will automatically hook up to the right thing. If you don't do that, you'll end up doing more manual configuration down the road. And if there's a change, you'll have to make the change in a lot of places. For example, if your data source is always saved at the, basically, or always embedded, I should say, in the report, then if you make a change, you'll have to revisit all of those. So let's say there's a server name change or something like that. Again, I mentioned it's basically the connection string, not much more to it than that. And you can create more than one in a report, and I'll demonstrate that. I'm going to have 2 of these data sources. They're going to point to the same SQL server, but to different databases. And I always like to name them with the database name. So when I create my report, actually create the report, what I'm going to do then is inside the data sources inside the report, instead of embedding it, defining it over again, I'm going to point to that one shared at the project level. Now I could name these the same. I name them differently just so you can see that they are different things, okay? I could have named them both AdventureWorks. And I can really connect to just about any data source because there's a list of maybe 10 or so different sources, but then there's also things called ODBC and OLADB. These things will have drivers that will connect to, dozens or if not hundreds of different sources. There is, I'm going to say it's a bug. I did report this when I first discovered it a couple of years ago, and I was told that it was a feature. When I create the data source and save the properties, what ends up happening is even if I have chosen use Windows authentication or whatever I used, when I save that, that goes away. I have to reopen it, because when I reopen it, I'll see that it's saved to do not use credentials. So I've got to reopen it. For this class especially, I'm just going to set it back to use Windows authentication and click OK, and then it works fine. So it is kind of a weird issue that you'll come across. So let's jump over to the, I'm just going to work in week 2 here. I already have a project created. And what I'm going to do is create a new, close that up. I'm not going to save it. Create a new shared data source. Again, I really liked the shared data source because I'm going to set it one time per project, reuse it, and if I always name it the same in different projects, things are just going to kind of come together when I publish the reports. I'm going to right click and say add new data source. And I'm going to give it a name. I like to give it the name of the database. So I'm going to call it AdventureWorks 2017. At this point, you could click build or you could type in the connection string if you would like. One thing to be really careful of, In the previous versions of this, it would always be defaulting to SQL Server, and now all of a sudden it's defaulting to SQL Server Analysis Services. So watch for that. Make sure that we're pointing to Microsoft SQL Server, and you can see there's a lot of other types of places that you could connect to. For example, Azure SQL Database, a SharePoint list, ODBC and OLADB basically are like the keys to the kingdom, all kinds of different data sources that you connect to. Oracle, a report server model, Teradata, XML. You can connect to Excel. I believe you do that through an ODBC. You set up an ODBC connection and connect through there. So I'm going to choose SQL Server and then click Build. And this should look similar. If you've worked with SQL Server at all, you've seen little dialog boxes like this to help you set up your connection string. In my case, I'm using localhost, and I have a named instance, SQL 2019. I hope that the majority of you watching this know how to connect to your SQL Server. If not, take a look at the article on setting up. There is a little section on connecting. We're going to leave the authentication at Windows Authentication. I'm going to choose AdventureWorks 2017. I can test connection if I would like to. However, typically I've found if I've gotten to the list of databases, I'm good to go. And click OK. So now that wrote that connection string for me. I'm going to go over to credentials and see that it's set at Use Window Authentication and click OK. I'll expand this and I'm going to double click on this, or I just had to click on it. And if I look at it, notice that this has changed to do not use credentials. I consider this a bug. I don't know. I've heard it's a feature. I'm going to switch it to Windows Authentication and click OK. Another thing to note about the data sources is if I right click and go to Properties, what comes up is not really the properties per se of the object. All it is the file name and the path to it. So that is not helpful. So you'll always have to click on it to get the properties to come up. So that is a shared data source. And when I publish a few weeks from now, when I publish my reports, you'll see that that gets created automatically for me out in reporting services. And if for some reason, while I'm doing development work, I am pointing to a test database, if that data source with the same name already exists, it won't be overwritten. So that's a good thing. So let's go back to the slides. Talk about data sets. A data set is the query itself. This is going to be different languages depending on what type of data source that you have. For example, if we're pointing to a SQL Server database, it's got to be a T-SQL query. If we're pointing to Oracle, it's got to be in the Oracle SQL language, etc. If it's going against analysis services, MDX, DAX, whatever language. I'm not an expert on those, so I'm just going to leave it to the people that understand those to correct me if I didn't say it right. But the query is going to be different. I'm going to really focus on SQL Server in this class. If I get a chance to play with some other things, maybe down the road we'll add some bonus. No promises there. So the reports, okay, so what we really focus on when we're working on a report is the report data window. By default, that's over on the left. And you have to set up this data source pointing to the shared data source, and then you can use that when you create your data set. I really recommend embedding your data set, embedding the query, because chances are that query is not going to be used in multiple reports. When we get to the publishing part down the road, I'll show you that any shared data sets that you use will end up published. And what we really want as far as published for people to be able to reuse are things that will be reused, such as, in this case, a list of products might be reused in lots of reports. I'm going to hold off on that for a couple of classes to talk more about shared data sets. But for now, just know that 95% of the time, the data set should be embedded. And of course, I'm going to write my query. I'm probably going to write my query in SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. There is a little query builder that you can use. I'm not a fan of it, but you're welcome to try it out and see if you like it. So let's take a look at creating. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a second data source here for Wide World Adventures. Wide World Importers, I should say. Change that to SQL Server, click Build, server name, localhost, SQL 2019, and Wide World Importers. Click OK, then I'm going to go back to credentials and fix that setting. It should stick. Okay, so what do I do next? I'm going to right-click on reports and say, not going to say add new reports, because you may remember me saying this last time, that kicks off the wizard, and I really don't want to kick the wizard off. I'll click add new item and choose report. I'm going to call this product list. Again, I can have a space in my report name. This is the user-friendly name, and click add. So then that pops open into this design view, and I can start, well, the next thing I've got to work in this report data window, but once I get that all configured, then I can start adding things to the report. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to data sources, right click, and add data source. I am going to call it just AW. I'm just going to do that just to differentiate it from the shared data source. However, it will still be pointing to the shared data source. I'm not going to accept the default here, which is an embedded connection. Don't like that, or I don't recommend it. And I'm going to use a shared data source reference. So I have two to pick from. I can see what's over in the Solution Explorer. I'm going to click that and click OK. And if you really look closely, you can see a little arrow telling me that that's pointing to a shared connection. The next thing I'm going to do is right-click on the Datasets folder and add a data set. And I am going to call this something that makes sense. And the reason I'm not going to stay with dataset 1, because I could have multiple data sets in my report as well, and that is not unusual at all. And so just to keep them straight, I want to name it, and I'm going to call this product list, whatever the query is about. This is saying use a shared data set. I'm going to skip that for now. We'll cover it in a couple weeks. I'm going to use a data set embedded in my report. Then I can choose a data source. I can see, I named it AW, so you can see where it came from. It came from that report data window. Okay, and then I have actually a query right here that I'm going to copy and paste. This isn't a T-SQL class. If you need to learn T-SQL, be sure to catch Kendra's class and click OK. if everything went well, you should see the data set over here opened up with all the items. Now, if there's any kind of an error, you'll see the data set name, but you won't see the item list. If you go in and make a correction, let's say, for example, you forgot that save credential thing over here, this wouldn't work. This is where you'd get an error. So then what I recommend is going back after you make a change outside of this dialog, always click refresh fields and click OK, and that should get you your field list. Otherwise, they might not show up. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is add a report header. I want a heading on the report that is saved from page to page. So I'm going to right-click, insert, and I see all these items that are connected to data, or can be connected to data, but also down here, page header and page footer. I'm just going to add a page header. I'm going to right-click and insert, and I get a much smaller list of items. These are items that you can work with that don't have to be connected to data per se. So I'm going to choose a text box, and I'm going to type in product list. There's a lot more than I could do with this, and we'll talk about parameters next week. So there's a lot of things I could add to the header, for example, concerning parameters. I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to change this to about a 24 font, and I can drag things around, resize, center, change the color, you know, whatever I want to do here. I kind of like making this box the same width as the report. That way it stays center for me. I don't have to figure that out. That is, let's just make it a nice blue color. Hopefully you saw that. Okay, so let's add the data that from our data set. I'm going to right click, insert a table. So there's two different, actually there's more, but two main table type structure. One's called a table, one's called a matrix. I will cover the matrix when we talk about grouping. They call it tablix or tablix, because these can be changed, they're interchangeable. So if I choose it and then look at the properties, if I right click on the edge, tablix properties. So all of a sudden it's calling, instead of calling it table, it says tablix. Okay, so how do I get the fields over here? Well, there's a couple of different ways, probably three ways. One easy way is just drag and drop. I'm going to drag into the data line, and it automatically filled in the column name for me. So up here in this header, it's just free text, and down here, it's a placeholder for a field, okay? Another thing I can do is hover over, just hovering, and this little box pops up, and I can choose one of them. And I need one more. So I can either right-click and insert column on the right, or I can just come over here and drag until I see that blue bar, and it pops right in. So probably what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of adjust these. I know that the name is going to take up a lot of space, so I'm going to just kind of drag that, kind of similar to how I would do in Excel. And at this point, I can preview just to see how it looks. And it looks pretty good. Obviously, there's some more that I could do. Let's take a look at the print layout. And actually, the print layout looks good. I'm not getting the headings. Again, I'm going to wait on that as well. We're going to have a week where we talk about some of the interactive and more advanced features. It's a little tricky to do. I'm going to wait on that as well. One thing I could do is select an entire row or an entire column and do some formatting. So what I'd like to do is just bold that first line, and maybe, let's see, I want to change that background color to a light blue, something like that. Take a look at how it looks. And to get that, it's going to keep coming up in the print layout preview, so I'm going to turn that off. And maybe this list price needs some formatting. I'm getting 4 decimal places. I don't really need that. So I'm going to right click and go to text box properties and go to number, currency, and use a 1000 separator. So let's take a look. So that looks much better. So this is okay for now. At this point, that's pretty much all you've learned so far. So let's go back and take a look at the slides again. And what I really want to emphasize is the order in which you do things, because I've noticed that students get kind of confused on what's a data source, what's a data set, when do I do what? So we're going to start with the project. When I have my project, the first thing I'm going to do is add a shared data source, 1 or more shared data sources. When I have them set up, I can add a report. The first thing I need to do in my report is go over to that data window and configure my report data sources. Those report data sources are going to point to, each one is going to point to a shared data source. Okay, so there is it's possible, even at that point, to create one that's embedded. I just don't recommend it. And I've seen people get confused, especially since the default behavior is the embedded. The default behavior is like the opposite of what I'm recommending. For data sources, it recommends, it defaults to embedded, and for data sets, it defaults to shared. And that's directly opposite of what I would like you to do most of the time. So I've noticed that people do get confused on that. So I really would recommend that you just do some practice, okay? The other thing that I'd like to tell you, so once we get our data sources set up, then do the data sets. And once we have the data sets set up, again, you can have more than one, then add your controls and do the configuration. So really it doesn't sound difficult, but over and over and over, I've seen people get confused on these steps. And so I just recommend that you practice and just keep in mind that the way that I'm recommending is opposite of the default. That's kind of annoying to me. Maybe other people recommend something different. Okay, so I'm going to go, really that's the last slide. So I'm going to go back over to here and do another report. Again, I'm going to right click. I'm not going to choose add new report. I'm going to choose add new item, choose report, and give it a name. This one is called, let me look at the query, is going to be called stock items. Stock items, and click add. Notice now that I have 2 reports set up. If I close one of them, I can easily double click to get it back. So really the navigation is not too difficult. Okay, so I'm going to close this one and let's work on the stock items. What's the first thing you do when you create a new report? You have to configure the data source. I'm going to right click, add data source, and I'm going to give it a name. This particular query comes from the Wide World Importers database. So I'm going to type in Wide World Importers. By default, it wants me to create an embedded connection, but I really would like to use a shared connection because I don't want to have to deal with 1,000 different embedded connections all over the place. So like if I have embedded connections, those live in the report. When I publish the report, I could easily reconfigure that to go to a published data source. However, that's a lot of extra configuration. So what I really want to do is choose Data Source Reference, Wide World Importers, and click OK. There it is. The next step is the data set. Click Add Data Set, give it a name. No spaces. This is an object name, so no spaces. Stock items. I'm going to use a data set embedded in the report, and I can choose the data source. I will see the data source that's set up over here. And here I can type in my query. I'm just going to copy it out. And paste it in. And click OK. And that one worked. Okay. Theoretically, I could have multiple data sources, multiple data sets, and in a report. That is not unusual. Let's say I had a list of the stock items from one system and information about the sales in another system. I could point to those in the same report, two different data sets. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is right-click, insert a page header. I'm going to right-click, and I could also pull from the toolbar. So here's the toolbox. I can also drag and drop. Okay, I'm going to call this stock items. I'm selecting the cell, and I'm going to go up here and make it 24 point. I'm going to rearrange it, drag that up, and click center. And maybe I want to give it, so there's really 3 ways I can change the properties here. I can change the properties with items that show up at the top. I can use the properties window. For example, I could go here and change it to this green color if I wish in the properties window. I can also go to the text box, right click and go to text box properties and go here as well. So how you decide where to go? I would say if the property is something you could easily click, not based on an expression, I would just use the items at the top. If it's something a little more complex or it's not at the top, you might want to right click. I feel like this is the more user-friendly dialog here. However, not all the properties show up. Some properties show up here. Some properties show up in the properties window. And if you're trying to format multiple things at once, you typically have to go to the properties window. So it's just really a matter of, look up here first, maybe look here second. Oops, not expression, not ready for that yet. Look here next, and if you can't find what you're needing, come over here and look. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is add a table. Right-click the body, insert, table. I'm going to drag it over so it's a little tight in the corner. And I'm going to just start selecting all my items. I ran out of columns, so I can just come over here and drag. And the name is going to need some extra time. And I'm going to pull up the bottom. So that's how it looks right now. I'm going to grab this and I will change the font. I'm sorry, let's just make it bold. Make it bold and change the background color to this light blue. Green looks kind of funny now. So I am going to change that to the dark blue. Goes a little bit better. And take a look. Since I do have a few extra minutes, I'm going to show you how to do your footer. Right-click, Insert, Page Footer. Now, what might you want in a page footer? Well, you might want the number of pages, you might want the date, and there's some really cool fields that you can use over here in this built-in fields section. So if you take this execution time and drag it over, and it's not letting me, this is something weird I've seen recently. Sometimes you have to drag it into the body of a report. Not letting me do that either. Okay, let's go text box and then drag it in there. There we go. So what you might have to do, and I think it's just being a little picky, because you should be able to just drag the field in. So what I ended up doing was creating a text box and then dragging the field into the text box, and that did work. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to go to the print layout view, and there you can see the date and time there at the bottom. I kind of don't like these margins, so I am going to change the top and bottom to 0.25, 0.25, oops, 25. Take a look again at it and see how it looks. Yeah, it looks a little better. Not quite so much space at the bottom. Let's see if I can drag page number in. So now that there's something in the footer, it's behaving better. Let me just drag page number in. Also notice that when I'm moving things around, I kind of have these blue lines that will help me line things up. So I see the number 1 down here. Another thing I can do, I'm going to stretch this out and make it a little wider. I can click into the cell and just say page. So here I've got some free text along with a placeholder. And when I go back and look, I'm going to, whoops, let's do Control 1. You can see that actually worked. So it's not really we're not really to expressions yet, but you can do a few things. Another cool thing is, let's say I wanted the word page italicized, but not the page number. Here I've selected page, and if I hit italic and preview it again, notice that page is now italicized, but the 1 isn't. So, that's a few extra things. We're going to dig into a lot more in subsequent weeks. So I think that's all for today. What I would really like you to do is go out to the GitHub page, and I will, later today, I'll add an assignment for week 2. And also a solution. A couple of the reports that I have you doing on the assignment are exactly the ones that I showed you today. But I think that's kind of helpful, because if you're not really sure how to proceed, you can go back to the recording and kind of follow me step by step. You know, click stop and start as you go. So that is all for now. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care. Thanks.